My name is Madison Vance. I am 32 years old, and exactly 5 minutes before I was supposed to walk down the aisle, I found out my father had not simply been delayed by traffic. He had chosen a side. I was standing in my wedding dress inside the bridal suite, with one hand pressed flat against my ribs, trying to slow my breathing before the music changed, when my phone started buzzing on the marble vanity. For a second, I almost let it ring. My fiancé, Tyler, was already waiting at the altar. The guests were already seated. My veil was pinned, my bouquet of white roses was ready, and I desperately wanted to believe that for once, nothing from my family could reach me inside that room. Then I saw my older sister Kaitlyn's name flashing on the screen. I answered, and before I could even speak, she gave a soft, mocking little laugh, the kind of laugh people use when they want you to know they thoroughly enjoyed hurting you. "Don't wait for Dad," she said, her voice dripping with clinical satisfaction. He chose to stand with me. The room went entirely silent around me as the weight of her words settled into the space. "How could you do this?" I whispered. She did not hesitate for a fraction of a second. "You should have known your place, Madison." My fingers tightened around the phone until my knuckles turned white and ached under the strain. I did not cry. I did not ask her why. I did not give her the satisfaction of hearing a single tremor in my voice. Anger wasn't loud or explosive this time. It was entirely clinical. I rubbed my eyes, trying to summon a wave of familiar regret. But there was only a chilling, absolute clarity remaining. This was not a nervous breakdown. It was a balance sheet, and my family's moral account had just defaulted. For 32 years, my affection had been treated by them as an unsecured, blind investment, a mandatory subscription where I constantly footed the bill while they systematically overdrafted my patience. That subscription ended at exactly noon. I stood beneath the massive, sunlit glass dome of the historic botanical conservatory in Savannah, watching the bright southern light fracture across the white satin of my gown. The air inside the enclosure smelled faintly of damp earth, stagnant water, and crushed orchids, a pristine, sterile backdrop that made the toxic smoke of my sister's betrayal feel completely foreign. I looked at my reflection in the full-length mirror, the quiet, compliant girl who had spent an entire lifetime stepping aside, making her own wounds smaller so that someone else could occupy the spotlight, was permanently gone. In her place stood a woman who finally understood that mercy without boundaries is nothing more than slow self-sabotage. I picked up my bouquet, smoothed the heavy lace over my dress, and opened the double doors of the suite. I did not search for a frantic wedding coordinator to manage my grief or alter the timeline. I walked straight down the transparent glass corridor, my heels striking the polished wood with a steady, unyielding, and methodical rhythm. When I flagged the venue director near the entrance, my voice was low, factual, and completely stripped of specious emotion. I issued my orders like an auditor closing down a bankrupt firm. I told him to completely strike Jeffrey, Kimberly, and Caitlin Vance from the official guest registry. I commanded the catering staff to immediately dismantle the entire head table placements reserved for my parents and sister, scattering their physical chairs across the secondary rows of the dining hall. Finally, I instructed the security detail to lock down every single side entrance to the conservatory. If my family intended to arrive late, slipping into the front rows to perform their unearned roles of parental devotion for a public audience, I was going to ensure they found nothing but locked iron gates and silent structural barriers. My family was not shocked by the cruelty of what they had done. They were simply shocked that I had stopped playing along with the script. Before they could even arrive at the venue to perform their calculated piece of fatherhood and sisterly devotion, I stripped them of their public presence entirely. Inside my mind, a completely different kind of sunrise was breaking, the kind made of cold facts, raw numbers, and a quiet, unyielding retribution. My future was waiting at the altar in the form of Tyler Stone, and I refused to let their generational damage delay my life by a single second. To anyone else looking at the empty spaces in the front row, the scene would look like an absolute tragedy. An outside observer would expect a bride to weep, to stall the processional music, and to beg the universe for an explanation as to why her own father abandoned her on the most important day of her life. But those people did not understand the deep transactional ledger of the Vance family. This was not a sudden, unexpected fracture in our relationship. It was simply the final, predictable entry in a lifetime of bad emotional debt. For over a decade, I had been forced into the role of the silent investor in their version of family, consistently funding a contract I had never actually signed. I had lived in a small, drafty apartment, skipping personal vacations, turning away from new clothes, and purchasing generic brand groceries, all while quietly funneling my personal cash reserves into the fluctuating development ledger of my father's commercial construction firm. My family treated my economy and my silence as a baseline given a structural subsidy they felt entitled to use without ever having to account for the human cost. While my older sister Kaitlyn spent $45,000 of family capital on luxury event design, branding, high-end lifestyle consultants, and empty aesthetic statements disguised as business getaways, I was the unseen structural engine keeping the family's corporate credit alive. My compassion had never been viewed by them as an organic bond. It was a luxury resource they had overdrafted for years without consequence. I remembered a specific mini flashback from the opening day of my independent child psychology clinic. The ribbons were cut, the walls were painted a soft, welcoming cream, and the front row chair explicitly reserved for my father sat completely empty for the entire afternoon. Kaitlyn had thrown a frantic, calculated aesthetic tantrum over a minor vendor dispute for her own branding launch, and Jeffrey had immediately folded under the pressure. He stayed behind at her studio to soothe her volatile ego, sacrificing my professional milestone to purchase a few hours of temporary peace. I had stood before my colleagues that day, holding my clinical plaque, staring at that empty seat, and training myself to believe it did not matter. But it did. When you grow up inside a chronic dynamic of favoritism and emotional neglect, you unconsciously construct a psychological prison without songbirds or song bars. It is the invisible chain of the survivor. You become so deeply parentified, so hypervigilant to the volatile atmospheric pressure of a golden child that you naturally fall into a state of learned helplessness. You begin to treat emotional neglect as standard air pressure, a necessary condition for remaining inside the room. You tell yourself that if you just compress your needs, if you remain entirely low maintenance and never demand attention, they will eventually notice your sacrifices and validate your worth. You convince yourself that your patience is a down payment on their future love, failing to see that your silence is actually functioning as a legal license for their ongoing exploitation. But numbers do not perform for a social audience, and the reality of our dynamic was written in cold assets. My independent clinical trust fund, $250,000 built through relentless night shifts, scholarships, and clinical excellence, was treated by my parents as an offensive statement. They viewed my financial self-sufficiency as a direct personal threat to Kaitlyn's position as the golden child who needed perpetual saving. I was supposed to remain small, useful, and completely invisible, a constant source of liquidity for their endless emotional crises. The cracked photo frame from my clinic opening sat exactly where my father's active presence should have been, a physical monument to his absence. Now, looking out at the transparent glass of the conservatory, the illusion entirely evaporated from my mind. This was no longer a narrative of personal abandonment. This was a formal corporate audit, and the Vance family was officially out of capital. The biological collective did not remain silent for long, as they realized their absolute control was slipping. It was entirely predictable, a psychological machinery of guilt designed to force my compliance back into the family grid before the public could notice the fracture. My phone began its rhythmic, frantic dance across the vanity table again, lighting up with a barrage of texts from my mother, Kimberly. She did not ask if I was broken after my sister's phone call. She did not seek to repair the devastating execution her oldest daughter had just delivered over the line. Instead, she opened with the traditional family layout of emotional gaslighting. Her words were a highly practiced script, typed out with clinical detachment. "You are overreacting as usual, Madison. Kaitlyn is having a severe panic attack regarding a critical venue layout dispute for next month's luxury gala. Your father simply had to step in to prevent a public scene that would ruin her business reputation. Be the mature, stronger daughter for once. Your sister needs us." Seconds later, a notification from my social media archive pinged. Kaitlyn had just uploaded a photograph from a high-end cafe down the street. She was holding a cup of espresso, looking flawlessly styled, completely relaxed, and entirely unbothered beneath a caption she had clearly weaponized for the day. Family shows up for the ones who actually need them, not just the ones throwing a lavish party for themselves. The strategic alignment between my mother's defensive text and my sister's public malice was flawless. They were entirely coordinated, a unified front designed to minimize their cruelty by rebranding my boundary as a selfish, dramatic tantrum. Then the screen flashed with my father's incoming line. I answered, my breath steady, my internal baseline entirely cold. Jeffrey did not offer an apology or an explanation for his absence. His voice was gruff, packed with the familiar weight of irritation that he always weaponized whenever my reality inconvenienced his comfort. Madison, do not make this ceremony difficult. He ordered through the speaker, his tone commanding obedience. We are trapped in traffic now because of your sister's emergency. I need you to instruct the venue director to delay the entire bridal march by 2 hours. I am your father, and I expect to walk you down that aisle. I am simply trying to keep the peace here. I looked out the massive glass panels of the conservatory, watching the gray industrial currents of the Savannah River cut through the low marshlands. That single phrase, keep the peace, landed with the chilling clarity of a bad debt disclosure. It was the ancestral prayer of the Vance household. The mantra used to justify every exclusion I had ever suffered. But standing there in the cold light of my wedding day, I finally understood the trap of cruelty's normalization. What my father called keeping the peace was actually a corporate weapon used to protect the narcissist from consequences. In a highly dysfunctional family structure, peace is a false currency minted entirely on the backs of the stable child. Enablers do not maintain peace. They merely enforce a systematic emotional tax on the high-functioning child. They require you to swallow poison, to accept invisible cancellation, and to manage their operational failures, all so the volatile golden child never has to face an ounce of true accountability. They protect the fragile illusion of a unified home by forcing the healthy child to become entirely low maintenance. The peace is already kept, Dad, I said, my voice completely stripped of specious emotion and family compliance. Because the ledger is officially closed. I will not delay my future by 2 hours to save your reputation. Nor will I let your transactional remorse occupy the front of my mind. The conservatory doors are shutting now, and your window to perform fatherhood has officially run out of capital. I hung up before he could respond, the clinical silence of the room returning like a shield around my dignity. Emotional boundaries are only effective if they are backed by structural iron walls and legal ledgers. I turned away from the phone and looked at Catherine Briggs, who was sitting quietly in the corner of the suite. She did not offer empty platitudes. She did not tell me to take deep breaths. And she did not ask me to consider their perspective. She understood that when dealing with emotional vultures, you don't use soft words. You use architecture. I stripped off my white bridal gloves with sharp precision and sat down at the mahogany desk. It was time to transition from an invisible family casualty into a ruthless corporate auditor. I looked at Catherine and said, let's check the financial ledgers. All of them. Right now. Catherine opened her secure tablet, her eyes narrow, cold, and entirely focused. Having run a major regional nonprofit organization for over 2 decades, she knew exactly how to track missing assets, decode hidden liabilities, and identify corporate fraud. My independent child psychology clinic had been legally tethered to my father's construction firm under a shared operational network, a structure Jeffrey had insisted on 4 years ago to supposedly reduce my overhead and provide a safety net. At 26, I had been naive enough to believe it was an act of parental support and protection. Now, with the scales entirely stripped from my eyes, I saw it for what it truly was. A backdoor pipeline built to ensure my independent capital remained accessible whenever the golden child blew through her own luxury event design budget. I watched the screen glow in the dimmed light of the suite, the spreadsheets reflecting against the pristine ivory fabric of my dress. This was no longer a narrative of personal rejection or family drama. It was a formal audit. With systematic, legal precision, I began revoking my father's administrative access to my clinic's primary operational fund. My compassion had been treated as an unsecured credit line for far too long, and I was officially pulling the plug on their liquidity. I clicked through the secondary authorization screens, completely separating my professional assets from his corporate footprint. It was cold. It was transactional. It was entirely necessary. Then, the balance sheet broke completely open. Catherine stopped scrolling, her fingers freezing over the glass panel of the tablet as a discrepancy flashed in red. "Madison," she said, her voice dropping into a dangerous clinical register. "Look at the automated audit log for your independent clinic expansion fund. We have an irregular, unauthorized capital drain that bypassed your main notifications." I leaned over her shoulder, my eyes locking onto the transaction ledger. 3 weeks ago, a transfer of exactly $150,000 had been executed, completely evading my secondary verification protocols. Catherine pointed directly at the master IT logs. Jeffrey had used his primary administrative override from our linked corporate network to silently reroute all text and email alerts to his personal device, ensuring I remained completely blind to the theft. While Kaitlyn plundered the account, Catherine pulled up the digital authorization document, zooming in on the confirmation block at the bottom of the page where the owner's signature was required. The digital signature block showed a clumsy, unauthorized rendering of my name, flagged instantly by the system's fraud detection. Kaitlyn hadn't just staged an emotional emergency to siphon our father's presence on my wedding day. She had actively committed a felony. She had forged my identity to execute an unauthorized withdrawal, funneling $150,000 of my hard-earned expansion capital directly into her failing luxury event design business to cover her mounting commercial debts. The stakes had instantly shattered the boundaries of family neglect and entered the realm of criminal exploitation. They had treated my life's work as a vault, to be plundered, and it was time to let the law handle the consequences. The audit path did not stop at my sister's forged signature. Catherine's fingers tracked the digital access logs further down the ledger, and that was when the final, lethal layer of the script was laid bare to us. Jeffrey had not been delayed by traffic or caught in an unexpected corporate meeting. He had discovered the $150,000 forgery exactly 2 weeks ago. Instead of executing structural consequences or forcing Kaitlyn to confess, he had actively buried the paper trail to protect the golden child and preserve the artificial image of family perfection. This morning, he wasn't pacifying an emotional crisis at her studio. He was actively attempting to intercept the secondary banking auditors before the discrepancy hit my personal clinic statement. His delay was a calculated containment strategy, a desperate attempt to protect his primary asset stream while treating my life's work as disposable collateral damage. This was no longer a failure of parental affection. It was a complete bankruptcy of character. The ledger of our entire relationship had never been built on love. It was a high-risk liability where I was expected to shoulder the absolute losses while they pocketed the social dividends. I watched through the transparent glass partitions as the Vance family was abruptly halted by security at the chapel gates, forcing them to redirect their frantic steps toward the outer corridor of the bridal suite. Jeffrey smoothed the lapels of his expensive dark suit, his face a practiced mask of patronizing urgency. Kimberly clutched her designer purse like a shield, her eyes scanning the venue for high society peers, while Kaitlyn stood a step behind them, her jaw set with the toxic arrogance of someone who believed she was entirely above the law. They walked toward the bridal suite with the blind confidence of predators who believed their currency still carried value in my life. They didn't realize that Tyler had already stationed 2 of his fellow firefighters outside my door, blocking them from entering the private suite and forcing them to face me only in the open corridor under the watchful eyes of the venue staff. They genuinely expected me to fall back into the old pattern to swallow the humiliation, adjust my veil, and accept their presence because the audience was already seated in the chapel. Jeffrey stepped into the room, his voice dropping into that familiar, soothing frequency he used whenever he wanted to demand compliance, disguised as forgiveness. "Madison, we are here," he whispered, his eyes flicking toward the closed chapel doors. "The ceremony is already 10 minutes behind schedule, and half the construction board is sitting in the center aisle. Stop this dramatic display right now. Let me take my place beside you so we can open the doors. We can handle the corporate accounts tomorrow, but right now, you need to think about how this looks to Savannah society. I looked at my father, my mother, and my sister, and for the first time in 32 years, I felt an absolute clinical detachment. I saw right through the performance, their high society branding, their country club memberships, and their curated family image were nothing but an illusion. It was the absolute illusion of the empty wallet's power. Their entire social positioning was a rented costume, a fragile shell financed entirely by the silent child they had spent a lifetime dismissing. They believed their historical authority gave them power over my reality, completely blind to the truth that their position only existed because I allowed my capital to fund it. The very second the silent investor cancels the subscription, the entire corporate facade turns to ash. They were standing on a foundation of empty debt, begging for a luxury line of credit that I had just permanently deleted from the system. I looked at Jeffrey calmly, the white lace of my sleeve catching the bright southern sun filtering through the glass. The word didn't leave my mouth as a scream. It was cold, precise, and absolute. No, I said. My father blinked, his face crumbling as he glanced at the chapel doors where the guests were already turning. What do you mean? No? Madison, please, don't embarrass me like this in front of everyone. I didn't raise my voice or show a single trace of anger. I simply handed him the printed forensic audit and the certified copy of the criminal report my legal counsel had just transmitted to the Savannah district attorney. Since my legal counsel had already secured an emergency injunction late Friday afternoon, that legal freeze had just dropped like a hammer on every single one of Kaitlyn's business accounts, while the local police department was now dispatched to secure the digital paper trail. You do not get to perform fatherhood at the last minute just because there is an audience, I told him. You chose convenience across a lifetime. Today, you simply lose my capital. Kaitlyn's face went entirely pale, her expression shifting from toxic arrogance to cold horror as she saw the official police documentation in his hands. She tried to step forward, her nostrils flaring as she whispered, "You're being vindictive, Madison. You're ruining my event design network over a family disagreement." But the high society wedding professionals and local coordinators hovering in the corridor were already watching her with visible disgust. She had spent her career constructing illusions for an audience, and now she was forced to stand in the reality of her own making. The real punishment wasn't the police report. It was that the father who had spent decades protecting her from consequences was completely powerless to save himself or her reputation. I turned my back on the biological wreckage. I turned to Catherine Briggs, the woman who had sat in the empty front rows of my life, celebrating my accomplishments when there was nothing for an audience to see. "Catherine," I said, my voice shaking slightly, "will you walk me down that aisle?" Tears filled her eyes as she slowly offered me her arm. Her hand was trembling, and mine was too. But as the heavy glass doors finally swung open, the music shifted rich, solemn, and unyielding. We stepped into the golden light of the restored botanical conservatory, leaving the Vance family standing in the corridor, entirely exposed to the elite crowd of professionals who would never hire Kaitlyn again. Step by step, the whispers faded behind the music. I looked ahead and saw Tyler Stone standing at the altar in his navy suit, steady, calm, and completely anchored. He did not look at my father for permission to read the room. He looked at me like my survival made me entirely worthy of joy. When we reached the front, Catherine placed my hand into Tyler's, kissed my cheek, and whispered, "You were never hard to love." I've come to realize that setting boundaries isn't an act of revenge. It is an education for everyone watching. It is a mandatory declaration of your own sovereign dignity. If you find yourself in a similar situation, if you are the invisible child who has been trained to become low maintenance just to keep a volatile family happy, remember who you are. True peace can never be built on you swallowing your own pain to protect an abuser's comfort. Forgiveness isn't always about keeping a toxic connection alive. Sometimes, walking away is the only way to set yourself free and grant yourself permission to exist fully. You do not owe people your loyalty just because you happen to share their DNA. If this story of boundary architecture and unyielding self-worth spoke to an empty chair in your own life, Hit that share button, subscribe, and leave a comment below with your own thoughts on reclamation. Let's make sure this message reaches the ones who need to know they are worthy of being seen.